All right, we're back. Thank you, JD, for that first part of the conversation. We're continuing the recording here soon after that, and we just want to continue the conversation. Maybe you got so interested in what we were saying the first time, you said, well, I'll go ahead and listen to the second podcast. But that's exactly what we did, is we just continued the conversation. I said I was going to say something about power that I kind of had a point of view I wanted to get across, and I haven't done that yet. So maybe I should get around to doing that. So maybe I'll start this conversation with a statement.
Okay.
And, we haven't rehearsed this or anything like that.
Right.
And, be critical about this. I want, if you say, Tom, that's a dumb idea, I don't think that's right. Or if you say, I think you're spot on there, or anywhere in between.
Okay.
I want your honest, thoughts on this. I do value your thoughts and opinions. And, you have a PhD in leadership just like myself. Mm-hmm. And, I really value your thoughts on this. Okay. Before I make this statement, though, and this point of view that I think that we should absorb and use, I do want to say that there's a method to my madness, if you will.
Okay.
This is the synthesis of a pattern of human history over a period of time. I'll now say what I've been thinking of. So my whole thing,
okay,
and we can dig in deeper if we want to. Where this comes from, how it comes from, how in the world I got there, because it's a pretty long journey.
Okay.
But simply, what my idea says is this, is that the legitimization of power is a major, important, and perhaps preeminent consideration of all human society.
Say it one more time.
Yep. The legitimization,
okay,
and by that, I mean social acceptance of power, is a major, important, and perhaps preeminent consideration. It's a very important consideration of all human societies. So I'm saying that legitimization, I'm kind of meaning social acceptance of power, how we go about doing that. As characterized by those who are included and excluded is I kind of add that on there. Or otherwise differentiated by degree and amount of power. That's my thought.
Yeah, I like it. But what ran through my mind as you were saying that is that if you go back, the further you go back in history, it came down, power was strictly physical power. Physical power. Goliath, he wanted to be king, he's going to be king. And back even further, and it's the same if you look at the animal kingdom and power. They all have limitations, and they all have their power zone. It's where they thrive, and this is where they win. All nature, I think, is built according like that. That everything has a certain dimension of power, and there's a lot of other entities that have less power, and a lot that have more power. And from that arena, what's fascinating is in the whole, there's like 100,000 insects. How can there be that many? I got mosquito, I got fly. But anyway, in that whole world of different creatures that exist on the planet, we're at the top of the pinnacle. We're at the top as a species against other species. But inside of our species, we still have that, your point, the struggle for that power. Which one of us is going to be in the lead? Which one of us is going to be the boss? Which way are we going to go? Me and you are in a car and we come up to an intersection and we got to decide, do we go left or do we go right? What factors, I think it has to do with your power concept, play in when we both say something, who will fold and who will turn left or right?
You reminded me of, my wife is the most wonderful person on this earth that I know. But I remember when we first got married, she would often tell me where she wanted to go.
Yeah.
And we pulled into this parking lot to go to this place to eat, to meet some friends there. And there was a parking spot that she saw, and she's like, park there, park there. She was so used to me doing what she told me to do when I was driving. I parked in another spot.
Risky.
And she let me have it, verbally. That's the spot that she wanted. I said, 99% of the time, I do what you asked me to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in this particular case, I decided I'm going to park here, and I'm the one who's driving. I
have the power.
Yes. So I mean, yeah. So we're not going to operationalize power, but I think it is important that to some extent we define what we're talking about in order to have a conversation on power. So I would just simply define power as the ability to do something. And I would define right. We can get more specific than government and all that stuff, but I'm trying not to belabor it too much. But I would also define right as the ability to limit someone else's power. So I know that might be an oversimplification.
Boy, that's good. You have a right to limit someone else's. That is the concept of having a right, is to limit somebody else's power. Parentheses, influence, control over you.
So I was reviewing the history of England again last night. I've got the book right here in front of me. And what's interesting is that when it was talking about power, it tended to talk about the ability of, typically it was talking about the ability of the government itself. Mm-hmm. or someone who held a lot of power or something like that. And then when it was talking about rights, it was talking more about the individuals or groups of people who are below or under that power in order to limit that power. But then I also saw another part where a king was also talking about rights. And in that instance, the parliament had already gained power and was therefore applying and using that power, and the king needed to have rights himself because he felt like the power of parliament was too much. So typically that was the language that it seemed like that was being used. And sometimes we mix that up. In modern day, I've heard someone recently who was in power say, well, that's our right. And no, because they're the ones who had the power, and they weren't trying to limit someone else's power. Mm-hmm. They were trying to basically consolidate and centralize power in themselves, which is a much different thing. But anyway, what do you think about those?
Oh, I think it's spot on, man. Spot on. I was just thinking here, like most topics, there's degrees of depth of understanding on various topics. And I use the analogy of skimming a stone across the lake. If you're going real fast, as our society and world is today, going real fast, you go ding, 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 right across the top, and you don't even get wet. If you slow down, you start to sink. And then if you stop, you really sink down. And I think it's the way people today, I'm a little concerned, is because from a standpoint that I 100% agree with where you're going, and I love the concept, and I think you're spot on with it. But I'm a little concerned that we're looking at things from a much deeper reality, while there maybe some of our audience might be skimming along the top right here. So I'd like to take the next steps and try to see if we can't take some of the premises that you've outlined, okay, and go in a little deeper and see if we can't apply it to those surface skimmers.
Yeah. Yep.
And I mean nothing derogatory toward anybody. The world we live in today is so fast-paced. I remember my relatives from Tennessee and Virginia, and I would go and visit my cousin and his father, and he'd be sitting in the living room, and I'd walk up and I'd say, "Hey, Dub." His name was Dub, his nickname, I'm sure. And I'd say, "How you doing?" And he'd sit there and look at me, and he'd nod his head a little bit, and he'd go, "Well, I'm doing pretty good. And I'm sitting there the whole time going, come on. I'm that skimming rock. I said, man, come on, just say it. It's not a discussion concept. Just come out with it. And it's that slower moving. The slower you move, the deeper you see things.
So I think there is, to get a bit more into that, a little bit more of the detail, I think there's, I think it's 6 powers, if you will, or 6 abilities that I think it's important to talk about. There's others, but certainly I guess what I would say to get a little more depth in that is that we know based on some history, and we can get more into that. We know that, there's this concept of needing to limit the power, particularly the power of government and people who have a lot more, or entities that have a lot more. But now that we know more about power, those same ideas, it wasn't just about government, it's about power more generally. So as we understand more about power, we can then understand that we need to place limits and checks and balances on other power, not just the political power of the government. Mm-hmm. So in order to go there's 6 different powers. Yeah, you look like you want to say something.
No.
Oh, okay. So there's
comfortable. I'm interested in this.
there's 6 different powers. I think that we can say, okay, it's not just the government. It's these powers also need to be checked and balanced and things like that. One is political, economic, ideological, information, and one that we think of most often, which is martial. So quickly, again, it's kind of very oversimplified. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure the person who wrote many books, I have a stack of books right here. The guy who first talked about these probably would just pull his hair out with me defining them in this manner. And if you want more details on it, go to Dr. Michael Mann's series on the sources of social power. Mm-hmm. But the way I will just quickly define this so we can have a conversation so our audience can understand is, when I say martial power, it's fairly self-evident, I think, but what we're talking about is the ability, because it's power, so the ability to threaten or use kinetic violence, physical violence, right? Or to threaten that. Political is the ability to make decisions for the society. Economic is the ability to control resources. Ideological is the ability to have control over or influence in a major way the culture and customs, which are important in and of themselves, because those are things that either impose limits or constrain or otherwise expand power. Mm-hmm. Information power is who controls communication.
That's becoming bigger and bigger every day.
Yes. In fact, that was not one of his, Michael Mann's original ones. He later published, so he wrote a whole series on social power from the beginning of time until the present. And then he later published adding informational power, which he had left out.
Yeah, well, probably why he did that in 100 years ago, people had to send a letter, here and there, and information wasn't like it is today. Today, we have all the information we need and then some. There's too much information. Information management is probably going to be a reality of some type, and people do it to some degree all the time anyway. But how do you manage information? How do you validate information? As our society is lacking a little bit from the integrity standpoint and a little bit on the erosional points there, then people might bend the truth just a little bit here and there. So when you're talking about information, you've got to validate the information, and then select from the valid, what are you going to take into account? And it ties into what we talked about the last session, with history, that responsibility of recording history accordingly. How do you measure that?
Yeah. Also, I feel like you just said something to me a few moments ago, which was, Tom, a lot of people are on this kind of superficial level, skimming the rocks, on the top of things. They've got daily lives. They're moving 100 miles an hour. And then it seems like I got in a submarine and I took it 100 miles deeper. So let me just take this opportunity. Maybe you can ask me some questions, dig deeper. What is it I mean, or help bring us to this more superficial level?
We talked about, what do you want to hit on the concept of power and how it's utilized in our society, or at a personal level? Or give me one topic and we'll go there.
Well, we've talked about, power. We've kind of defined power. We've gone from history to wisdom and the importance of these things and defined power. And I've said, well, there's the legitimization or social if I could talk, acceptance of power, which is really important. And then I've also further gone on to say, okay, there's these different types of power. And not only do we need to limit power like we think of in government, like the checks and balances that we find in the Constitution, but maybe, just maybe, there's these different types of power, because in modern day America, if you have a great deal of economic power, you can buy political power. I can tell you this for a fact because I've run for the Woodlands Township here, the community that we're in. Mm-hmm. I know how it works now. In modern America, you can exchange any one of those types of power that we discussed for another, such that some people can have inordinate amounts of power while others do not. Mm-hmm. One of the things Dr. Michael Mann points out is that he says, I have no way to verify it, but it seems, when you have studied other people, like the sources of government and how government came about and how power came about, that human society was, I'm going to use the word, I'm going to be careful about this, relatively equal. Okay, people were not equal. Obviously you had some guy who was 6'4" and huge, and he had more martial power, let's say. Mm-hmm. He had the ability to beat up, let's say, this little old lady who's 5 foot tall, or whatever the case, with not much strength to her. But in societies, what Michael Mann was saying, that there's evidence that for thousands of years, our ancestors, human beings, resisted any person from having an excessive amount of individual power over other people within their society. They actively resisted that. They didn't want it to happen. And I think what happened was, when it started happening, then I think very quickly when you started gaining a tall hierarchy, you had organizations which were able to function. It freed some people to do other tasks, and you had the division of labor and other people to do other tasks. And then you had societies like the land of Ur, Egypt, and the civilizations, the Mayan civilization, all these different civilizations. So there is a point to where these hierarchies are useful to human accomplishment. But there's also the possibility of abuse of that power.
What went through my mind just then was, it might be too far of a stretch. If so, just say pass. Can you correlate that concept into the development and the acceptance of gangs in our society?
Gangs?
Yeah, gangs. Think about it. It's martial power to a degree. Then they become accepted, and then they become, their own little society, like a subset society. But it's because of the people that are playing accept the power that they want to have. They're letting their people have the power over them. So they become part of that fabric. And some of these gangs are, huge. And some of them are formalized organizations, and goes there. So I'm wondering how, can we learn anything from that? From how gangs begin in the beginning. It's from a need. There's some kind of need that somebody has, and they feel that this person can help me with my need. And it gives them completion. Kind of like Hitler, and again, back Germany after World War II World War I was just beaten to a pulp, and people had a need to raise their head up again. And he gave them that. So maybe that's one of the ingredients that the people need.
Yeah, based on my reading, a lot of people the youth who get involved in these type of things is, they've been raised oftentimes a single parent. Maybe their father's been away, or they've lived in poverty, or whatever the case, that their parents, even if you have a 2-parent home where both people are working outside, they don't feel a sense of belonging where they are. And it's through the gang how they initially start to obtain this sense of belonging and has its own culture and therefore identity, and they get pride in this particular organization. And of course, doing what they do, oftentimes it's criminal activity, what we're talking about. So they are tapped for one of these type of powers, selling drugs for economics, martial power, threatening other gangs, trying to have their own territory. So I think it's anytime you are trying to grow and expand, this type of power always is present. It's always there. It's always necessary. And the question is, I'm not necessarily saying, and I'm not saying that growth is not a good thing, or that organizations are not a good thing. I think organizations are a good thing. I mean, it's through having organizations that a lot of progress has been made. It's through organizations that people can come together and coordinate and work with one another. The problem comes in is when there's an imbalance. And now we're at the point in one of my great concerns is that there's a point to where competition goes from being a coordination, a collaboration, to the other spectrum. The other side of competition is conflict. Now, throughout human history, there's always been the ability to, if there's even an extreme conflict, there's a way to recover from that. The problem that we're facing, I see, going into the future is if you have a thermonuclear war and you have an extreme event dealing with that, there's no real coming back, except, if someone survives and then you have to claw your way back to, more of a modern society. But that's an event that I don't think we can recover from. And just based on the pattern of human history and conflict and the way we handle things, it looks like to me that we're on our way to having something like that. So to me, having this concept of power is important, not just for human relations, and so we avoid our immediate government from lording over us with a grand tyranny, but it's also a way of looking at international relations and all human relations, because that's all a nation is. I call it a super organization. Mm-hmm. It's just an organization which is over other organizations. Mm-hmm. And nation states, we don't think very much in terms of anything other than what we now call a nation state, or nations, right? National identities. But up until fairly recent history, they weren't even a thing. Mm-hmm. So human beings developed from essentially families, and small villages were people who were part of the family. Mm-hmm. Essentially a distant cousin or something like that. And then whatever caused the conflict between some villages and other villages, then they had to be concerned with martial power. Once they became concerned with martial power, I think that's part of the impetus that caused the need, more than anything, to have someone who was in power over others, because they needed organization in order to win in a military conflict with others. It could also be cooperation through trade. They needed a structure. And once you start gaining these organizational structures, take Egypt, for example, there's a point to where ideological power comes in. You say, this guy, he's a god. He's a lord, he's a son of God. He is, we need to worship this guy. And you have this, they've taken over other smaller civilizations, even smaller organizations, and they have slaves, and they've got people who can produce their food and allow them to read and write and learn from history themselves and technologically advance. And then you get these huge societies. The point is, though, at some point, which is where we are today, that level of competition, a measure of power which is excessive, has reverberations not just within our own nation and between human relations with one another and between small organizations on a international scale. and I didn't even mean to go here. This is just where it went. This is just where it went. But certainly it is the case. I didn't mean it to get this heavy, but it is certainly the case that we are talking about potentially, destruction of the earth through nuclear winter and things like that. Maybe that's getting too heavy, too deep.
You're going right to the finish line. Well, you hit so many points there. So many points. I was thinking, I brought up gangs. And typically when you have a gang of people with common causes and this, that, and the other, and they all form an entity, if they don't break the law, they probably would be called a charitable organization. I think the principles are similar. It's just that one doesn't use, you said there's 6 primary drivers of power. And I think the gangs, in my mind, based on everything I've seen, it's Marshall. That one right there seems to be the dominant one, force or whatever. Where in other organizations, like I'm affiliated with one now called Angel Reach, and it's a tremendous organization.
I've donated to Angel Reach.
Have you?
Yes.
For those of people out there who are not familiar with it, in the foster care system in our society, when kids become 18 years old, they got what's called age out. At 18 years old, they're basically kicked out. Some good foster families might really take them in and help them out or whatever, but most of them, they're not required because they're not getting any more funds. So at 18 years old, you got a guy who might or might not have a high school education, has no place to live, no transportation, nothing. And they're just pretty much thrown out in the world. Well, Angel Reach is a buffer. It's a place where these kids who really want to be good and take care of themselves and participate in the society have a place to go. It's kind of like, it's a little bonus time for them. And I think they can stay different places, but up to age 24. And you see so many good stories where they get a good job, they get their GED, and they move forward. These kids have it tough. The statistics on it are stunning and scary. Like 70% of them will be in jail within 3 years. Yeah. That's not exact, but it's horrible.
Yeah. So I actually not only did I donate to them, and I was actually trying to get more involved and have my kids more involved too, so they could see what happens. Because I was adopted at birth. If it wasn't for the people I call my parents, I would have been in some serious problems. But as far as the statistics, so my understanding is over 70% of the guys end up going to jail. And more than 70% of the girls have babies, which then go right back into the system.
Yeah.
It's feeding itself.
Yeah.
And
but anyway, tying it together here, so you're talking about this power concept, and we're talking about the Marshall, the 6 tiers. The gangs are more martially, and this one's more. Which one would the 6 would that one be? Like Angel Reach.
Angel Reach. Oh wow.
I'm just trying to understand the dynamics of, when you have this power, which power structure produces better results.
Yeah. So we're a lot of the basis for what we're talking about here goes back to economic theories and economic power, I think, but all of them. I mean, the people, our socioeconomic status. So those people are definitely, if you had a spectrum of power, they would be lower down on the scale of power. So let me kind of explain what I mean this way. Let's say you are Bill Gates. Okay. And I'm Joe Biden.
Okay. Thanks for giving me Bill.
We both have an enormous amount of power. Mm-hmm. I have the ability to use my political power to gain economic power.
Yep.
And not necessarily ethically, but you also have the power to have a massive influence, and in fact, get yourself even into politics if you wanted to. You can pay for a lot of advertising. You can make yourself famous pretty quick with the amount of money Bill Gates would have. But then what happens over time, this is a very clear pattern, is the more power you have, the more that power is used to gain more power. And we have, a relative parity in power in some regards. If I'm president of the United States, I have my finger on the nuclear trigger. You can't beat that.
Yeah.
You can't beat that in terms of martial power. But you also have an enormous amount of economic power. If you're Bill Gates and you say, I need to talk to the president's probably going to pick up the phone, because you could, without you, I cannot sit in the seat, or at least my donors, I cannot sit in the seat and hold that power in the first place, the way it works. So power begets more power. But if you lack power, it's hard to gain it at all. And so we often talk about this huge gap in economic power a lot of times, the gap between the rich and the poor, the 1% and all of this. But there are people who lack all forms of power. If you have a need, you can make a donation, or you can get that in exchange for your power. I can use political power and exchange that for something else. I can get what I need or get it on behalf, right? That's the reason why we give people power, right? It's not for them. It's supposed to be for the society. And if power isn't working, and that's the point. Power, again, is ability. It's not something you earn. It's something that society gives to you. And should be used, if you're taking an ethical point of view, on behalf of the society. Now, if you can benefit from it, that's a good thing, right? If others can benefit from it, that's what you're supposed to be using it for. And research shows, some of the leadership research that I've involved myself in and done and read indicates that there are people who are at the top that, not only are they slightly altruistic in many regards, right? There's this exchange relationship that they have with people, but there's also this relationship where they also can benefit from their work. They actually perform better. They perform better for themselves. They perform better for their team, their organization, everything. So there is a point where I strongly believe that personal benefit that can be gained from something is important. If that's the only reason you're doing it, though, I would argue that the power that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. If you have power that is endowed to you for any reason whatsoever, that power should be being used on behalf of other people for some bigger, grander purpose, has meaning or something. If you're the president of MD Anderson Cancer Center, you should be working toward those objectives on behalf of society, right? Not just being concerned. And so there's a point to where, again, the idea of power corrupts absolutely. It's just a question of how do we balance this power? Because without having the broader conversation, without other people considering this, we are giving power to other people. People don't just have it. And so that's why it kind of goes back to my thing about legitimization. Legitimization of power is a major, important, and perhaps preeminent consideration of all human society, because when you see the president, he's there because you allow him to be there. Don't mean to get personal, but he's there because I allow him to be there.
Yeah.
We have built the society in such a way, back in the times of England, right? It was divine right of kings. It was the reason why the Pope was so powerful, because of ideological power. People believed that the Pope was the representative of God on earth. And when the Pope said this person is king or this person is not king, that person was king or that person was not king, until people started getting different ideas and they started cutting down the power of the Pope and trying to gain legitimization in some other way. Well, the power is in, now we say in America, we say it's in the people. That was a concept that was built over time. So when the people speak, well, what is the people?
Yeah.
Who's included, who's excluded, and you get into all this stuff. The point is, there's always, if anyone has power, it's given to them by other people. And if you fail to be involved in that conversation, to think about, you're automatically giving people the power through the way it is legitimized. And imagine if you had a lot of power, and then you then had the ability to influence the education system and the culture, and you then made, like, if you're the king, you want everyone to believe that you are the legitimate power. Well, if you have the ability to influence that and say, well, I should be the king because I have all this this is the way we legitimize power in our society, and that benefits me. It's not supposed to be for you. It's supposed to be for the society. And I'll shut up for a minute and let you talk.
No worries. Let me challenge you on that.
Yeah.
I agree with you. It's supposed to be for society. We all should contribute. Is that a rule that everybody has to play by? Or can they be selfish? Isn't that their right to do what they want to do?
Yeah, I mean, certainly.
Now, I agree with your position. I'm just saying, if I didn't, and I said, well, the only reason I want to be the CEO of Angel Reach is because they pay X dollars. And I think that I can milk that cow, play the little game, and I can get my money. And as a tangent off of my personal focus, some other people benefit from it. And I think the right way should be, as you explained it, we should be focused on that. But I just don't see the world shifting that way, where there's more people are more concerned with others than this is the term "me generation." And me, I think people are going that other way, and that it's about power, and it translates from influence. Like you talked about, the king wanted to have that perspective where people looked at him or whatever. But the same token, today people have the same thing, but they're not kings. So how do they accomplish that? I think it's called the news media.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a definite conversation we need to have. It ties right in with power. News media today is more power, can influence power more than anything. On and on. And it's something I think will dovetail right into your concept.
So, mice have a sense of social reciprocity.
Okay.
So you take a big mouse that's older and you put in a little mouse. That big mouse, if they play with one another, there's some research on this, the big mouse will lose the game to allow the smaller, younger mouse to stay engaged. It knows, even though it has the ability to win, if the little mouse loses constantly, it's not going to play anymore. The personal benefit to the big mouse is letting the little mouse, win on occasion, so that they can continue to play. That's a form of social reciprocity, and it is a basis of morality to some extent, not only for mice, but in humans. And truly, there is a point where I think person who pulls too much power to themselves, even if they have the ability to, is at some level going to lose out, whether they recognize their loss or not. It's eventually going to happen.
Lack of acceptance by society. So in a sense, the social mass is in control.
Yeah, it's always been the case that power ultimately lies in, they talk about the people. That's where the concept of the people comes, because of martial power. Ultimately, whatever you have, you can squash it and kill it through martial power. And who has the most amount of martial power is a lot of people, particularly in the United States. This whole idea of the Second Amendment, having guns and things like that. And it's always been the case it doesn't, if you have a government, you just have so many millions of people that can overrule you. I mean, just they did this calculation. If we were to have a conventional war with China, some people have calculated that we couldn't win it. We would need to use battlefield nuclear weapons, because if the entire society was motivated to go against the United States, you couldn't kill enough people using normal conventional weapons that there wouldn't be more born and grown up and enough to keep fighting.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a point to where if people are willing to stand up against a tank or something like that, but put weapons in the hands of those people. So the power, if not just for social acceptance, I mean, even just from the martial aspects, but in order to have a society that is not in chaos, you really need like a peaceful social acceptance. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, the idea of propaganda and information power, ideological power comes in to get people to think the way you want them to think, so that you can continue to have or maintain or continue power that you hold or increase it. Mm-hmm. And that is definitely a concern of mine. And I'm just going to get my headphones off and grab something real quick.
Okay. Hey, by the way, you guys have the number. Give us a call at any time. We'd like to hear what you have to say, your opinion, contribute to the conversation. That's how we learn things. Everybody has a different perspective on things. If you disagree, if you agree, give us a call.
Yeah, so what I wanted to grab was just, there's a bookshelf and it happened to be right there, and I was able to get this. This is one of the most profound books in human history, and few know of it. It's called On Power, The Natural History of Its Growth by Bertrand de Jouvenel. And a lot of people who are familiar with political philosophy...
Hold it up to the camera just for a sec.
Yeah.
There you go.
Here we go. On Power by Bertrand de Jouvenel. A lot of people are familiar with, let's say, if you study political philosophy or you study history of England and the power differentials and situations that was going on there between the Parliament and the king as they were going into civil war and things like that. They're familiar with a guy called Thomas Hobbes, who basically was trying to defend the divine right of kings, and it's important to have a king. And basically what he says is that the reason why we need a king is because we need a strong power that keeps society in order, and without that very strong power, then we're going to have chaos and all this stuff. So he was trying to justify that. His is called the Leviathan. Well, Bertrand de Jouvenel uses a similar monster. He calls his the Minotaur or Minotaur. And basically what he says, and he details this, and you probably want to take a good look at that one at some point, but basically he chronicles case after case after case after case, and it's so thorough. It is so deep. It is amazing. And basically what he says, if I could summarize it in a short amount of time, it's that power has a tendency to grow. And once there's a little bit of power, the tendency is for it to centralize and bring more power unto itself. And that's basically what government does. And this book is mostly him detailing how that happens. And again, example after happen. Now, of course, if you have a person who is a virtuous person, a hobbit-like figure who is resistant to power and who is more interested in doing things for society and a little bit more concerned about that, gains maybe a personal benefit from doing their work or whatever the case, but then is also concerned with power and what happens with it. Because I think in order to improve and have civilization and society, we need organizations, we need to some extent hierarchies, whether they're flatter or taller or whatever the case. But it seems to me that we've always had government, we've had power, and the question is limiting it, and how do we do it? This guy says it grows, and I depending on who's there, but over time, eventually, I think he's correct.
Absolutely. That goes in, it builds and it continues to grow. That's a question a lot of people have asked about term limits for the government. You get people that are in there for decades on end, and have they lost perspective because their power seed has evolved, and now they've got a reality all in itself. Excellent, man. A lot of topics on a lot of perspectives on power here. Anything else you want to wrap us up with?
Well, yeah, I want to introduce the concept of
Okay.
Polybius.